Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the Engage podcast. Well, you're looking very smiley. Peter, I wonder if you could explain, this is a serious podcast and we've barely begun and you're already nearly laughing. What could have made you laugh like this?
Well, I'm just hoping that Isaac begins his episode before your introduction so we can see your antics before the camera started rolling.
You're talking about outtakes. If anyone watching would like to see an outtakes video from what happens before we officially start the cameras rolling and release the podcast, then you can always comment and request such a thing, and maybe at some point this year we'll release an outtakes video. What do you think?
I think that's an excellent idea.
I think you're saying that because you know that most of the outtakes will be embarrassing ones of me, with a few of you, but I do... Before we start, to kind of get the nervous energy going, I do sometimes talk a lot of nonsense. Yeah. I'm going to be honest.
Yeah.
It's true, isn't it?
Yes, I think that is absolutely bang on.
Also, another question that comes to my mind before we get into what we're going to do this week, serious question, is the way in which we're dressed is very different.
I was thinking of commenting on this as well.
I know why I dress like this.
Yeah.
What compels you to dress with that
I know.
striking combination of green and light blue?
I don't see anything wrong with green and light blue. I mean, I would say I'm in keeping with the rest of the comms team, personally.
Yes,
it feels like you're the outlier in this room of three of us.
I don't think I'm the outlier in the room of just us three. I think I'm an outlier in the entire organisation.
Yeah.
I'm one of the few remaining people who actually bothers to wear a shirt and tie, although not every day. I don't do it every day.
But I mean, surely, if we're with a podcast, if we're looking to appeal to a younger demographic, are they going to be responding to the suit and tie?
Well, let's put it out there. Do you think I should continue to wear a shirt and tie on this podcast, or do you think, like my co-host Peter, that I should, how can I put this, go in a different direction? Please comment under the podcast. You can email us as well. Is there an email for this podcast?
I hope not.
No, I don't think there is. Don't email us. Just comment under the podcast. That would be great.
It does also occur to me, if anyone's just listening on Spotify, what we've been chatting about for the last minute will make zero sense to them.
Well,
but
that's it.
I guess you can watch it on YouTube and you can find out there.
We always want people to go to our YouTube channel, don't we? And we want them to subscribe, not just go, but subscribe.
Absolutely.
Follow our YouTube channel at care.org.uk, and you'll get access to not just this, but loads of other content as well. Now, we thought we'd do something a little bit different for this podcast. Rather than sort of focusing on one big story and then maybe adding in a sort of a secondary story that's connected, we're actually going to look at 4 different stories, although some will be connected, and we really just want to talk about them and then give a kind of Christian perspective on each one. So we're actually going to start with a court case in Scotland, and it should be said that there are rules that govern what we are allowed to say and what we're not allowed to say. So we are going to talk about this within the law. Obviously, we're going to talk about it very carefully, but I wonder first, Peter, do you want to just sketch out for us what is the specific case and why do you think it is so significant?
Yeah, sure. So this is a case in Scotland where a trans woman doctor, so that is someone who is biologically male, although we'll come on to what they said about that. They had a situation where they were sharing a female changing room with a doctor in the A&E department who is I guess the term is cis woman, but a sort of biologically born woman. That biologically born woman felt a bit uncomfortable at sharing a changing room with a trans woman. And so the trans woman has then submitted a complaint. And effectively this has ended up in a court case because the complaint meant that the biological woman was being rebuked for feeling uncomfortable with sharing a changing room. So that is the sort of facts of the case. I guess the reason it is important is it really does kind of put a finger on what is at the heart of this debate. So the trans debate tends to revolve around what should come out on top. Is it your sex or is it your gender? Is it the chromosomes which you were born with, your biological sex? Is it your gender identity, which is the feelings which you've got, and sort of like if you say, well, I feel like I'm a woman, does that make you a woman? And then obviously sometimes rights come into conflict, don't they? So we would believe in the importance of women's rights, but also there is a right and we'll work out as a society quite where this right extends to. But it's a right for a transgender person to exist and to dress how they want and to call themselves what they want. And so how do you resolve a tension when those two rights do come into conflict? So is it legitimate for the A&E doctor to say, actually, I do feel quite uncomfortable with someone who is biologically male coming into a female-only space, or is it not? So that is sort of what's at the heart of the debate in question.
I thought it might be helpful, actually, and this is lifted directly from a news story about this case, to quote from both lawyers who are representing the two individuals in question. So this is Sandy Peggy's lawyer, Miss Cunningham, and she said that the starting point is that an employer is not entitled to give an employee permission to harass. Whether or not the second respondent had permission to enter the women's changing room isn't relevant. What matters is what he did and what its purpose or effect was. He said he was entitled to be there as he's a woman. The claimant says he's not entitled to be there as he's a man. It doesn't appear to be about his medical or surgical status. And then the lawyer acting for Dr. Upton, Miss Russell, said that Dr. Upton was entitled to be there because she was given permission, adding that whether or not that was right or wrong should be taken up with NHS Fife, who gave permission. Is worth saying Dr. Upton was indeed given permission to enter the women's changing room and bathroom. But even that is interesting because you notice that both lawyers applying a different pronoun to the individual in question.
Yeah.
And again, that takes us into, I think you're right, to the heart of this, which is if you are on the side of or if you want to be seen as being on the side of transgender people, then you're going to use the pronoun that they prefer. If, however, you take the view that you actually cannot change your biological sex, then you're more likely to use the birth pronoun, as it were. And even within the Christian church, this is a matter of debate, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's such a thing as, it's called pronoun hospitality, where out of respect, in order to remove a gospel barrier, you might be inclined to the view that it's appropriate and okay, in good conscience, to use someone's preferred pronoun, even if that differs from their biological sex. Yeah. But more and more I'm seeing voices within the Christian community saying, actually, that is a form of deception, that's a form of lying, and therefore we shouldn't do that. And that is another one where you sort of like, where's that going to go? Is that going to swing predominantly one way or the other? Or is that something where actually we have to say we have freedom in Christ, under God, in good conscience, to choose the path that we think is best and most appropriate? And if I could add one more thing into the mix, I do think an angle on that as well, it depends how close you are to the individual. If there is a transgender person and you are friends with them, you may well choose to exercise a form of pronoun hospitality out of friendship. The flip side is you may feel, even within the confines of that friendship, that out of love for them, you don't want to do that. You see, love gets used for both approaches. I find this, and I say all this having not really decided, I'm not in that position. So I really do sympathize for brothers and sisters in Christ who are actually having to weigh up what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right when you say that there is freedom in Christ. I think Christians can legitimately come to different views on it. I think there is a distinction, I think, between using someone's preferred name and using someone's preferred pronoun. I think I would always call someone by the name which they've adopted.
But not their...
But the position I have personally come to is I wouldn't tend to use the pronoun which they have adopted. I think one way one can do that is actually by trying to not use pronouns at all. So we have this sometimes when we're writing about, when we're writing a news story or a long read on a Friday about a trans case. I generally will try and avoid using a pronoun full stop.
Yes.
And I'll just use the person's name.
Yes.
And I think that's a good middle road where you're not giving offence, but also you are not giving in and saying, actually, I agree with you when you say you're a woman or a man, because I might not.
Yeah. Do you think that the outcome of this case could set a legal precedent that will help to decide on the clash of rights that you articulated, the clash of rights between women's rights on the one hand and the rights of transgender people on the other?
Yeah, I think it could do potentially. I mean, we have seen other cases where those things have come into question. So the big ruling was the one with Maya Forstater, wasn't it? Where it effectively became established in law that someone was allowed to hold a gender critical view. And so it is possible that this might do something similar. I think the interesting thing with this case is it is it's almost about someone's right to be uncomfortable. Are you allowed to be uncomfortable or to complain about a trans person coming into a single sex space? And that is, I guess, what we're going to find out the results here.
I'm always struck by the fact that this is also very relevant for any church that may, for example, be building a new premises or a bigger building or making updates and modifications to their toilet facilities.
Yeah.
I've seen churches do this all manner of ways. I've seen some keep male only, female only toilets, and then have a third option. I've seen some go down, nope, we're going to keep male and female only toilets. That's it. And then I've seen some where they took the decision that they would make them male and female just from the get-go in anticipation that may at some point in the future become a legal requirement anyway. And so they're kind of getting ahead of the curve and saving themselves some bother. And time will tell, I suppose. But again, it brings home why this issue of transgender rights, women's rights, the clash between them, a potential hierarchy of rights emerging, and also Christianity and the right to hold gender critical views and so on and so forth. It brings home that this is actually very relevant to just our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I mean, just one other detail which I think is worth drawing out from the case, and this is in no way looking to comment on which way the case is going to end up going. It is purely an interesting thing to remark on. So Dr. Upton, who is a trans woman, when asked whether she had a biologically female body, she called... I've just used the pronoun, haven't I? Dr. Upton called that term completely nebulous and said that term had no meaning in science. And that is something which I think you do sometimes find within society, of people saying, well, actually, the whole concept of biological sex is nebulous or doesn't really matter. That, as an argument, I would have real problems with. And you would get some serious pushback from people who wouldn't historically have been Christian allies. So the likes of Richard Dawkins would very strongly push back against a statement like that. Because sex is actually binary. Yes, there's a very small percentage where of people who have some sort of intersex condition. But sex is a binary. It is one of the few things within the world which is a binary.
And you can never articulate it enough, can you, that Genesis 1:27, in the beginning, God created them male and female, that's binary, complementary but different.
Yeah.
And again, the Bible's theology of the body and the importance of the physical body, that we are embodied souls, we're sexed beings, and that actually Jesus kept his physical body post-resurrection as a massive signifier that the body matters.
Yeah.
It's not just a bag of chemicals that will become dust again. That is both true, but actually the whole point is we have a bodily hope, which is we will have new resurrection bodies, an amazing reality that we will walk around the new world and we will be able to touch things and we'll be able to feel things. All of those things that we associate with having a body, that we're, it's the classic thing, isn't it? We're not going to be just fairies floating around.
Yeah.
All of which to say that Christianity has a wonderfully rich view of the body.
Absolutely.
Much higher, much greater than our contemporary society. And I think that, a rediscovery of that would be for the benefit and the blessing of absolutely everybody in society.
Completely. I guess final thing to say on this case, and then we should probably move on to the next thing. If you are trying to learn a little bit more about the transgender
I know what you're going to
debate,
do. I was going to do this, but you're going to do it.
It feels like a good moment to mention it.
You're right. Mention away. What could I do, Peter?
Well, since you asked.
Yes.
So we have just released a new video, Understanding Transgender, which explores what the Bible would have to say in the trans discussion and what's going on in our society. Particular focus on the CAS review, which was the UK government's review into gender services for children and young people. It's up on our YouTube channel. Please do give it a watch. It's got lots of really helpful stuff, which I think is a very good starting point in this debate.
Let's move on. I just wanted to flag a result that came out of the Court of Appeal today, because I think it is really encouraging. This is the case of Christy Higgs. I'll just fill in the backgrounds, say what's happened, and then very briefly we can comment on why this is so significant. So Christy Higgs, basically what she did was she was dismissed from Farmer School in Gloucestershire after she raised concerns on Facebook about extreme sex education and transgender ideology that was being taught in her son's Church of England school. And initially, an employment tribunal upheld that dismissal, but it went to the Court of Appeal and they've actually reversed the ruling from the employment tribunal. And it's the first time in employment law where a judgment has effectively established a legal presumption that any dismissal for an expression or manifestation of Christian faith is illegal. So it's been called a groundbreaking ruling. It confirms the Equality Act does protect traditional Christian beliefs in the workplace. And for me, I think the big takeaway here is it is a reminder that laws which so often can appear problematic or we are concerned that they're being weaponized against us actually protect our freedom of speech. And it is a marker in the sand. It is a case that I think will be referred back to. And I think the encouraging thing from our perspective, from a Christian perspective, actually from society's perspective, because this is good for everyone, is that it's saying actually you can be critical of extreme sex education materials and of transgender ideology, and you should not be dismissed because of that. So again, we would always say, wouldn't we, that you know, we have freedom to hold such views. How we communicate those views, it's not a matter of legal or illegal, but from a Christian perspective, we want to always be combining truth with grace. Sometimes that's known as and called convicted civility. But I think John 1:14 says it so much better. Indeed. Truth and grace. But this is really encouraging. And so just a good win for Christians, I think, for society in terms of free speech.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's really reassuring, isn't it, to see that outcome? And I think you're right to say this is likely to be a precedent-setting case, because there have been other stories which we have come across where Christians have been disciplined or removed from their posts for expressing similar things. Yes. So I suspect you're right. This will be a landmark one.
Also, we're saying that this case, it's taken 6 years to get to this point. And actually, often that is the way, because, of course, court cases take so long. And also, you know, it's interesting, isn't it, that there was one ruling and then it's gone to the Court of Appeal and that's been reversed. And often, again, that seems to be the pattern, that you get a ruling that's very poor from a Christian perspective or troubling from a Christian perspective. Then you go to the Court of Appeal. Let's be honest. I mean, thank goodness we live in a country where we have recourse to courts of appeal. And we're able to challenge legal rulings. It's not like, you know, we're living in a country where there is no court for us to go to, or if there is one, it's so heavily biased, it's so heavily whatever, that actually we've got no grounds to stand on. You have to think that, gosh, I wonder what helped influence the idea of an independent judiciary. And I do wonder whether the Bible and Christianity's influence in our nation had something to do with it. But I think it is hugely encouraging.
Yeah, completely. And even the concept of free speech itself, right?
Is
that the idea that everyone should be equal and everyone should have a voice.
Yes.
And that is a Christian
Yes,
principle.
absolutely.
And yeah, I don't... When you look at other societies around the world or ancient societies, I don't think it is a coincidence that it is the ones who have been most influenced by Christendom, to use another contested term, which have ended up with kind of concepts of freedom of speech enshrined within them. You would not have had freedom of speech within ancient Rome, for instance.
No, and I've always found this a really interesting question. Maybe one point we can actually really get into this. Of if you were trying to defend the concept of free speech biblically, how would you go around constructing a biblical? Because I sometimes think there seems to be this sort of almost naive assumption that the Bible would just give us a defense and it will be lovely.
Yeah.
And I think you've actually begun to provide the foundation of that. But I get a little bit frustrated at sometimes what I think is lazy proof texting.
Oh, I agree with that.
And I also think that you know, ultimately, one of the reasons the Apostle Paul commands us to pray for kings and all those in authority is that we may lead quiet, godly, and holy lives in all kind of peacefulness with those around us. And ultimately, because God is Savior, and because that does actually prosper gospel proclamation. But no sooner do you say that, than you then have to also just remember that the gospel also can flourish in a society where free speech is utterly removed. So you've kind of got you've got to pay respect to that tension and just be careful about how we speak about free speech from a biblical perspective.
Completely. And I think the term freedom of speech itself, I think, has probably far more to do with debates in America in the 1700s than it does to do with the Bible. The concept of sort of the voiceless should have a voice, or we're told to speak up on behalf of the voiceless.
Proverbs 31:8.
Exactly. A classic care text.
A very good care text.
And that, I think, shows that when you have a society in which Christians are governing, they ought to be providing a voice to everyone else. I think the tricky thing is within, say, a New Testament world, that is not the case at all.
Yes.
And so then people are told to not expect freedom. Christians are not told to expect freedom of speech for themselves.
Yes. Yes.
So it's that we should be providing it for others.
Yes.
But we shouldn't have an expectation that we will receive it from others.
No, and I think the other thing to say is that, we want to be careful about how we talk about the erosion of free speech when the reality is we have still in this country predominantly a huge amount of freedom. And I think
completely agree.
Again, sometimes the narrative, it can feel like, and I am not denying for a single second that there have been terrible examples of miscarriages, I think, of justice when it comes to street preachers. There have been people who have been dismissed, I think, unfairly for expressing orthodox Christian views. But the picture, the bigger picture, is that we're still able to meet on Sundays. Our churches are not being infiltrated by and large by the police. At least that doesn't happen very often. We can still go door to door in our district, in our neighbourhood, and we don't get reported to the police. I think these are fantastic freedoms. And I don't know how long they're going to last, but I think let's just use them while we have them.
I mean, certainly I'd be very I am always very wary about Christians in this country crying persecution, because we don't actually know what that looks like.
No, I don't think we do. Yes.
Shall we move on?
Let's move on, yes. So I think we wanted to talk a bit about the Middle East.
Yeah. Gosh, what a tricky one to talk about.
Yeah, from the frying pan into the fire,
absolutely,
as it were. So we've gone from sort of, so it's all the easy topics, isn't it? Transgender rights, and then we've gone to sort of freedom of speech, and now we're talking about one of the most.
Why did we do this?
Complicated parts of the world. Well, there's part of me that feels like when we get onto our final topic and teaser, we're going to be ending the podcast by talking about the assisted suicide bill at Westminster. That both of us will feel like we're on firmer ground, trying to sort of unpick what's happened in the Middle East. But I think we just wanted to acknowledge that it remains an incredibly tense situation, and especially with headlines reporting that the peace deal between Israel and Hamas could in fact be off, and the fact that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered the Israeli Defense Forces to mass once again on the borders of Gaza because Hamas have said that they are not going to release any more hostages. They've accused Israel of breaking in bad faith the peace deal. They've said, for example, that aid trucks are not being allowed through to Gaza, and Israel have said, well, if the hostages are not released by this Saturday, that they'll continue the war, as it were. And then just to further complicate things, President Trump has waded in.
I was wondering when he was going to get his first mention.
Yeah, quite early on. He's basically come up with this sort of real estate deal where he wants to basically stop any Palestinians from returning to Gaza. America would turn it into some kind of turn it into some kind of, I don't know, bizarre utopia. And instead he wants Egypt and Jordan and Lebanon and other countries around the Middle East to take in the Palestinians who should be going back to their homes in Gaza. And even this week, the King of Jordan sat next to President Trump in the White House. And I think actually very fairly said no. I mean, he didn't quite say it in those terms, but that's what he meant. He was saying, we're not going to be doing that. We're not going to go along with your slightly odd real estate deal. And I find the whole thing, I mean, Trump has also, by the way, I should just add, Trump has also changed what he originally said. So even Trump has had to sort of kind of backtrack, although he's not framed it as such.
You mean when he presented Gaza as like a seaside resort in waiting?
That's right. Yes, apparently that's that's sort of been modified by the press secretary, first of all, and then President Trump himself. In the filmed conversation, they do this thing in the White House where you've got the Trump and then you've got the visiting dignitary. So the King of Jordan was next to him, and that's where Trump sort of just modified some of his language around this, which is probably a good thing. But I mean, anyway, the point is that you suddenly, the whole thing has felt very fraught. Even when the peace deal was signed and there was lots of, it's Trump, he did it, or it's Biden, he did it, and this person, and that person. And it's just a reminder that actually peace is so fragile.
It absolutely is. And I think the difficulty in this situation, which has always been the difficulty from the beginning actually, is it's very difficult to see what the end game looks like. Like, what does a solution look like? So we might all talk about how we'd love to see a two-state solution. That probably wasn't very, very realistic before October the 7th, and it's certainly a good deal less realistic now. When a two-state solution was put before the Palestinians back in the mid-2000s, they rejected it. The people in Gaza have ultimately elected Hamas as their leadership. Israel is not going to want Hamas to regrow. What does a solution look like? And I think the answer is that there isn't a clear, easy one. And so, as much as I think President Trump getting involved is particularly unhelpful at this time when a ceasefire is so fragile, the idea of at least thinking outside the box, I'm not averse to at least coming up with ideas in terms of, clearly the status quo as wasn't great. A two-state solution is unlikely. So what is actually going to happen?
And I also think that, sometimes I think amidst all of this, the human tragedy of all this, we can miss it, can't we? That whatever our views, you're still talking about hundreds of thousands of people whose entire lives have been completely uprooted on both sides.
Completely.
So the families of the 76 remaining hostages who don't even know if they're alive, to live with that uncertainty, but also the families who lived in Gaza, whose buildings and homes have been utterly destroyed and who have nothing to go back to, and infrastructure ruined. And, one of the things that we always talk about on the podcast is the importance of listening to people that we disagree with. And I think this is a classic case, isn't it? And there's so many around the world where you have deeply entrenched positions and an unwillingness really to get together. It has happened at various points in history, but to really be willing to try to understand the other's perspective, that's actually a very Christian way of approaching any dispute, is to respect the human dignity of the other and to show them love by listening well to them. And I think that applies as much to big diplomatic tensions as it does to, one-to-one conversations. It's just the stakes are that much higher.
Completely. I think one of the difficult things with any conflict is there are two virtues which we want to try and hold in tandem. So peace is one virtue, and we know that is as a Christian, that is a really important thing to aim for because we follow the Prince of Peace, and he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And we also believe in the importance of justice as well. And so we believe that wrongdoing should be punished. We believe that one day evil will be judged by God himself. The difficulty, I think, in a conflict like this is if you purely focus on one of those virtues at the expense of the other, you end up with a fairly untenable position. So if we just concentrated on peace and forgot that justice should exist at all, then that's almost brushing evil under the carpet. If you just focus on justice and not on peace, well, then there is no room for mercy or for grace. And somehow we've got to have the two in tandem. And it's really challenging to see how we're going to get there. I think the other thing which, particularly when you're getting claims and counterclaims in the Middle East, and when you, as you rightly point out, see the immense suffering both with families of hostages, but also in Gaza, and particularly in a conflict for which the seeds have been there for a very long time, in that for decades this has been on and off. I'm so reminded that you can't just split the world neatly and easily into right and wrong. And there's that Solzhenitsyn quote, isn't it? Where it says, the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart. And actually to recognise that, okay, yes, this conflict might have been started on October the 7th, or this round of it on October the 7th by Hamas. But then you also have to question, has Israel's response been proportionate or has it gone too far? And it is really difficult, I think, to work out what has been right and what has been wrong. There are not clear-cut positions. And I think when people have attempted to come down purely on one side, that's not always been helpful.
It's part of the problem, isn't it, of people who feel like they need to have an opinion. And I think that sometimes a wiser approach is to start by acknowledging what we don't know, rather than sort of jumping ahead to sort of, boldly pontificating on a conflict that is, I think, very, very complicated for precisely the reasons you articulate. And that doesn't mean that you can't and shouldn't form views. I think I'm wary of sort of some of the dogmatism that gets expressed, and or perhaps more the way in which views on this conflict are expressed. It's so polarizing that you end up with these sort of very polarized sides. And again, I come back to the point of that there needs to be some way of being able to talk together, of being able to get around the table together. I mean, you're never going to see progress unless you can achieve that end. And I think that is a Christian way of dealing with it, of responding to it. And also, you on the one hand, you don't minimize or seek to downplay or dismiss the human suffering and tragedy of all of this. And at the same time, you recognize that, God has granted to civil authorities the responsibility to protect their people, to protect their citizens.
Absolutely.
And so you're absolutely right. You have these tensions, and sometimes I think we're so keen to sort of untie all of the tensions, but actually we need to live with the tensions, because it's a broken, fallen, sinful world. And I always think if I lived in the Middle East, I would be absolutely an evangelist on one side or the other. I'd have signed up, and I'm not there. I'm not fully aware of all of the intricacies of the long-standing, deep-running suspicions and hostilities, and the whole thing of the kind of the Christian Zionism, as it were, this theological idea that somehow Israel is a special nation. Still, I find, if I'm absolutely honest, and this is very controversial, I personally disagree with it. I think that it's an attempt to say that somehow still they're in some form of old covenant relationship with God. The old covenant is obsolete. It is done. It's fulfilled. It's finished. There's a new covenant now, and Jew and Arab, Jew and Palestinian can be united in a new covenant in Jesus. We could talk a lot more on the Middle East, but we do want to finish, I think, by talking about assisted suicide, and an issue that is present in the House of Commons at the moment. Kim Leadbeater MP has introduced Private Members Bill to give terminally ill adults with 6 months or less to live the legal right to choose an assisted suicide, and she trumpeted the fact that this was the strictest assisted suicide bill in the world. And she made mention many times, including in her speech at second reading on the 29th of November, that a High Court judge, no less, would be part of a 3 tiers of scrutiny that would be applied to any request for an assisted suicide. And get this, the sponsor of the bill, Miss Leadbeater, still not sure how to pronounce her name, she herself has tabled an amendment to her own bill, which would have the effect of removing the High Court judge safeguard. The bill has not even made its way out of committee yet. It is going through line-by-line scrutiny, and instead it will be replaced by a panel of experts, social workers, psychiatrists, because, of course, the one thing that our incredibly stretched social work sector has is time to give voluntarily to sit on assisted suicide panels, despite the fact in other countries this approach has not really worked because, as one evidence giver to the committee said, in countries where they have this panel, they've actually found it difficult to find social workers to even sit on the panel, and I'm not surprised. So suddenly the situation feels a lot more in flux. And a bill that passed by 75 votes, I think it was, 55 votes, 55 votes at second reading, we always knew that there was about 30 MPs who said the only reason they were going to vote for it was so that it would have further scrutiny. I think on principle alone, they should be voting no at third reading, expected at the end of April. But even if they agree with the principles, they should be voting no at third reading because of the absolute dog's dinner shambles that this entire process has become, with a biased committee, biased evidence sessions, and now a sponsor who has watered down the big safeguard in the bill. So, I mean, this has become really astonishingly inept, poor, bad. And I wish I could say with confidence that this bill will be knocked back at third reading. I still harbour doubts that it will. But my goodness, I think Kim Leadbeater is doing all of the hard work, in one sense, for us. Obviously
it was a massive blow when the bill was voted through at second reading. And that does tend normally to be the best place to throw a bill out. But I do think in this debate that it is not a foregone conclusion at all that this bill passes. You're right. As in that debate, a number of people said that they were voting for the bill at this stage and they wanted to see changes made to the bill. Now, I would argue they should have voted it down at that point regardless. But we are where we are. Certainly there have been some who have come out and said, look, if it's going to be like this, then I'm not going to vote for it. So you've had two MPs from Reform who voted for it.
Rupert Lowe, Lee Anderson.
Indeed. So they have both now said, look, if it's going to be like this, then I'm going to change my vote and vote against it. I would expect to see others for whom that is the case as well. I guess the other point, which it really does illustrate, which we have said all along, safeguards do not hold. And the reality is, in this situation, we've got a safeguard being got rid of before the bill has even become law. And it's not all, it's also not the only one under consideration, is it? Because there's also an amendment from a Lib Dem MP, which is being tabled, which would mean that people with a neurodegenerative disease like Parkinson's would be able to access assisted suicide with 12 months to live. So that could be another way in which a safeguard is being eroded straight off the bat. So the whole idea, which you pointed out, the strictest or safest safeguards in the world, I find it almost quite difficult not to be really dismissive of that statement, because I don't know whether Kim Leadbeater actually believed it, but I would personally say it was downright wrong and possibly deceptive. I do not think that it is accurate in any way.
Well, some are even saying that the whole talk about safeguards was just PR. It was a strategy designed to win as much support as possible. And this was always the plan. I mean, just by comparison, Canada passed an assisted suicide and euthanasia law in 2016. Within roughly 5 to 6 years, a key safeguard disappeared. In the United Kingdom, in the House of Commons, Kim Leadbeater introduced her private member's bill, assisted suicide bill, and it passed its second reading. And within 60 days, a key safeguard has basically disappeared because she's removed it from her own bill. And so I agree with that. My concern is that I think that a good number of MPs, basically new to Parliament, new to this issue, perhaps never really had to grapple with it or think it through before, and are not necessarily approaching this through the lens of our job is to scrutinise the legislation very, very carefully from the public safety angle and to really make sure we have robust policies and laws being passed, but are more just coming at it sort of with a kind of like, well, I'll see what my colleagues are doing. I'll see where the majority wind is blowing. I'm very aware that Keir Starmer, the leader of my party, or the Prime Minister, is really very supportive of this bill. Number 10 seem to be supportive of this bill.
Absolutely.
And so you have this situation where it's almost, I felt at second reading, like a blob of MPs sort of just voted for it because they felt like its moment had come, rather than they were really willing to stop and to think about what was being proposed. And my hope is that, you know, even Sky News Sophie Ridge did a very clever piece of journalism where she said, oh, look, this is not what you're supposed to do. It's breaking all the rules of TV. But I want to play a clip from that was recorded the previous night where Kim Leadbeater was talking about it being a High Court judge who would be involved.
Yeah.
And then she basically said, like, maybe it was my fault. Sophie Ridge said maybe it was my fault. Maybe I should have pushed her. But I took that at face value. And the very next morning, Kim Leadbeater stands up and announces that she's planning to table an amendment that would remove the role of the High Court judge. I mean, it's just staggering.
Well, yeah, I mean, the comms around it all has been utterly shocking.
Yes.
Like you almost couldn't make it up. I mean, they repeatedly denied, because there were rumours before that the High Court judge rule was going to be dropped, and they repeatedly denied that. Well, now they end up just looking a bit silly.
They do. And, let's come back to the principle here, because actually I don't think that it is defensible as a Christian who believes the Bible to support any form of assisted suicide. And I don't think that that is defensible for the simple reason that I do not think God has given us or granted us the right as human beings to decide when people die or when they don't die. I think that because we're made in God's image, that gives life an intrinsic value that can never run out, no matter what situation or circumstance you end up in. And the heart of that always is to move towards the suffering individual, to say, it is still a good thing that you are in this world. It's still a good thing that you exist. That is a better story than what Kim Leadbeater believes, which clearly is, well, if you've got 6 months or less to live and you're terminal illness and you don't want to go through pain and misery and suffering, which we can understand, by the way, then ultimately what you need is lethal drugs that will paralyze your nervous system and end your life prematurely.
Yeah.
Actually, a good death is possible, and the UK, by the skin of its teeth, remains a world leader in the provision of palliative care. So I was in a meeting just this week, and a doctor was telling me that we're still probably the best when it comes to palliative care, although we need a lot more funding, and so on. But ultimately, I think there's a lot of mystique around this, misreporting, bad impressions being given that somehow there are lots and lots of eventualities where we have an agonizing death. And the truth is that thanks to the amazing progress in modern medicine, that those cases are few and far between. They do happen, and they are awful, and our hearts must go out to people who are suffering in agony at the end of their life. But honestly, the power of palliative medicine is, in most cases, pain can be managed at the end. So there's so much else that's kind of wrapped up in this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just some statistics for you on palliative care, because the phrase Cicely Saunders, who was the person who pioneered it, always used to say was there is so much more to be done. That is absolutely still the case today. Research suggests that 215,000 people miss out on end-of-life care each year. That is a figure which is likely to only be rising, given we have an ageing population. The APPG on hospice and end-of-life care wrote in a report last year that NHS commissioning of hospice services is currently not fit for purpose. It is estimated that around $4.5 billion was spent annually on end-of-life care. That might sound like a lot. That is about 1% of the NHS budget, and far less than we would spend on speculative things like trying to find a cure for cancer.
Yes.
So it is an urgent priority.
Yes.
And again, we should be imploring our MPs, please sort this out.
Absolutely. And now is the time to amplify our voices, I think. Now is the time to be contacting your MP, writing to them, emailing them, arranging to go and see them to try to make the point that even if they agree in principle with this bill, they should vote against it at third reading, because the process on such a weighty, significant issue has been so poor. 80% of the committee, the evidence the committee have heard, has been biased in favour of assisted suicide. And even then, some of the people in favour were pointing out the flaws in the proposed legislation. So I think now is the time to speak out. And I also think, I'm really struck by feedback from our churches team, who are often out giving talks on assisted suicide. And invariably, someone will come up to them afterwards and say, I thought assisted suicide was okay, but you've persuaded me this is not right. And what that speaks to is the more we are putting out the arguments against assisted suicide, the more likely it is people change their mind. Big public polls showing 80% support it. Well, actually, polling demonstrates that when you put the big arguments in front of people, they stop supporting it because they realize this will be utterly damaging to the social fabric of our nation. So I'm praying that probably the 25th of April, that's when third reading will happen, that it will get knocked back. If you want to know more about the bill, if you want to know more about the topic of assisted suicide, you can go to our website and you can download our end-of-life topic primer, or topic guide, sorry, I should say. And it is absolutely brilliant. It will give you a comprehensive overview of where we're at, of the key players, of the issues involved with assisted suicide. So, I mean, that is absolutely worth going to our website, downloading, checking out. And I'm sure we'll revisit this topic in the coming months as we move towards D-Day, I suppose, in some ways, as we see what happens.
Yeah.
Massive. 4 stories that we've looked at. We've been going for 45 minutes. Can you believe that?
Goodness me, time flies when you're having fun talking about such jolly subjects.
Well, maybe next time we can talk about, I don't know, if we could, along with the Christy Higgs thing was really good news, but we could find sort of 2 good news and then too bad, but that feels kind of, it's going to end up being very forced, isn't it? Like we're going to be scraping the barrel like desperately, like please,
like some good news.
Some good news. Anyway, if there's things that you would like us to talk about, then please do get in contact with us. You can comment underneath the YouTube video. You can comment on social media as well. All of our contact details are on CARE's website, care.org.uk. Reach out to us. Let us know what you'd love to hear us kind of discuss and toss around. I suppose that all that's left for us to say is thank you very, very much for watching and engaging and for commenting and for liking. Please keep doing so. Leave us good reviews as well on any of the channels that you engage with us on. Any final word from you, Peter?
Just to say that James is, of course, awaiting his fan mail. So you can write in and who knows, he might even send something back.
Those days are long gone. I used to get quite a lot of fan mail, actually, when I was doing my morning devotions during the dark days of COVID lockdown. But unfortunately, times have changed and the fan mail has dried up, actually. Which is fine. I don't mind. It's absolutely fine if just one person, just one, wrote to me. That would make a difference. It's been great to be back on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I look forward to being back again very soon. Until then, goodbye.
Take care.